Should business leaders care about AI governance? Why have only 1/3 of organizations a formal AI governance strategy in place? And why has shadow AI become such a massive corporate headache? I'm Robert Crane, and today's podcast is about AI governance with Dr. Eric Orlowski. He's an AI governance specialist, researcher, and consultant at the National University of Singapore's AI Institute, the Department of Anthropology in Uppsala University in Sweden, and the Center for AI Leadership in Singapore. The Robert Crane podcast starts now.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
You are a governance specialist and researcher. If the listener of this podcast is a business leader whose only real goal is to maximize their profit and increase shareholder value, why should they care about your work? What is the actual value of AI governance for an organization that only cares about profit?
It's an important question. I think it's a great question, and it's one I get more than you'd think, actually, in some ways, because I think on the one hand, you tend to frame, or the discussion tends to be framed around like corporate interests on the one hand versus kind of AI governance on the other, and they're sort of mutually incompatible. One is about sort of controlling the other one doesn't want to be controlled, and so on. There's all sorts of trade-off being kind of in the conversation here, right? But I think what that framing misses a lot is that kind of on a simple, on a kind of very basic level, good governance tends to be good business practice from the perspective of things like customer trust, things like the actual quality of products that can give competitive advantage and so on, right? So it's not just a matter of the sort of stick part of things, right? Where if you don't do this correctly, the government is going to come in and beat you until you behave, kind of thing. There's also a carrot attached to this, right? So like looking at all of this together, I think it really brings into focus that like good governance across the board, right? It's not just necessarily about AI governance, but good governance across the board. Yes, it does sort of limit you from having, potential legal problems, right? From like sort of not fulfilling certain sort of regulatory obligations, but it also gives you a sort of competitive advantage. It can increase customer trust. It can make you build better products, provide better services to customers, and that will sort of make you a better business at the end of the day. I think the challenge is that the trade-off is often seen as one of like speed versus kind of like safety or whatever. But I think there is some truth to that, but I think it's worthwhile remembering that like it's much easier to build a really bad service, but that doesn't mean you're running a good business.
But what you're saying now, that sounds all very reasonable. But so what I see here on my screen is that according to a McKinsey report, about 1/3 of organizations who use AI actually have formal compliance or governance strategy. So I was wondering, then what is the reason that large-scale adoption hasn't happened yet?
That's a very good question, and I think in a lot of ways it's a $1 million question. I think everybody almost everywhere kind of struggle with this, and I think it's a deeply multifaceted challenge. It's very easy to get bogged down in the very big conversations around, data protection and privacy and transparency and all of these things, where you tend to foreground all of the things that you should be doing that also sound very scary and very expensive and very sort of risky. And that's fine if you're talking to, Microsoft or Google or IBM or whatever, because they have an army of lawyers that are going to sit in on these meetings and will be able to kind of like assist of like, is this worth it here? Can we do that here? And on top of that, they also have the sort of, I think, time and space to maybe put certain aspects of their business in a timeout while they develop very specific, very sort of much more watertight solutions that are sort of within regulatory sandboxes and so on and so on. You can't talk to a company with 10 employees like this. Because, if you have this conversation with them, the first thing the owner is going to do is they're going to reach for the phone, they're going to call their lawyer, and their lawyer is going to go do nothing. The safest thing you can do is nothing. Don't touch this with a barge pole. And I think going back to sort of your previous question, the challenge here is that we tend to like talk a lot about the stick. But at the end of the day, like there is also a lot of carrots involved in this, and so partially it's like I think to summarize, partially is the aspect of uh, it's unclear sometimes or very often I think what the benefit might really be for a small business, and that needs to be communicated in very much in terms of small businesses. But also for people like myself, it's very often the risks are the things that are foregrounded, and they sound scary and expensive and really really dangerous for a small business with say 5 to 25 or whatever employees. So in this sort of situation, it's very clear that like why take that risk? It sounds expensive. It sounds potentially very dangerous from a legal perspective. And finally, we're really unclear what we'll get out of it. And I think that's where, at least in the context of here, that's where a lot of the adoption challenge lies. It's very much I think, much more in the communications aspect of things.
I want to talk with you about so-called shadow AI, which has
Hmm.
become a massive corporate headache. I actually see it in my own work environment. So
Sure.
yeah, employees are using unapproved free generative AI tools to do their daily work. And basically they're turning to these platforms into corporate Trojan horses, what I believe. How do you govern a technology when your own people are smuggling these tools through the front door?
Yeah, no, that is especially for large corporations. This is a massive, massive pain to deal with. I think the answer is I think on some level decept or sounds deceptively simple, but will require I think a lot of corporate commitment. And it's basically the way you deal with it. I think it is basically you need to have effective thought through forms of like enterprise governance for AI in place. That's the way you deal with it. You deal with it by bringing it out of the shadow and into the light, right? So there's this, I think, both balance between having clear sort of frameworks and rules and things set in place as to what you can use, what you can't use, a clear amount of training, sort of what are the limitations, and also just also talking about like why you can't use certain things,
Hmm.
because somebody might go, yeah, but why can't I use this model? And the response, like, because management says so, is usually not going to make somebody sort of follow along. Like people are going to want to know things that impact their work. They're going to want to understand it, right? But then also like incorporate, your designers and product managers and operations people and whoever else, right? They're the ones that are doing the work, and you need to listen to. They're fundamentally the experts in doing this job, right? And I think that also needs to be incorporated into this kind of adoption process. So it requires, like, again, the answer I think is kind of deceptively simple because it's basically just adopt AI in a good way in your
Hmm.
in your enterprise. But it requires a lot of corporate buy-in. It requires commitment, and it requires kind of this careful, intentional engagement with whatever products and services might exist. Careful commitment as to like, is this worth as something we should buy in externally? Can we develop this ourselves? Do we have the know-how? What are the risks of doing this? And so on and so on. And also like not doing everything at once. Do it in a sort of, again, do it as a form of like more enterprise transformation that anybody knows can't happen in 48 hours. This is something that takes a very, very long time. At least in business terms, a very long time, right? To do right. But that doesn't mean you have to do everything at once. You can also do it
Hmm.
incrementally, right? Uh, an example that comes to mind of just to kind of again ground it a little bit are we recently had some conversations with IBM here about what they've done, and they've made a huge internal development or sort of enterprise transformation project over the past, I think it is 2 years, where basically they did just this. They looked at like what sort of corporate governance structures are required to be put in place, and they started putting them in place and streamlining everything after that, and really aligning all of getting all of their ducks in a row, in terms of like, okay, which roles are missing, which roles can we redefine, how can we move this around, what structures are needed, who's in charge of what, where does responsibility end, and all of these things, right? And only when they had all of that in place, that's when they started actually adopting the tools. And but it allowed them to actually, once they've had everything lined up, it allowed them to carry out a very very fast adoption that's also kind of comparably safe and like minimally disruptive to how the company overall works. and operates.
So my next question that I have is about the responsibility for AI governance. So I assume that it lies with the CEO, but the reality is that most CEOs, they are trapped by their corporate mandate. They have to keep their stakeholders happy, have to make profit, and so on. But if executives don't understand AI governance in 2026, does that mean that the traditional corporate CEO is obsolete for the AI era, or they should just hire a chief AI officer and then get it done with it? Or is that maybe a way for the CEO to outsource their own accountability?
Potentially, yeah, yes to everything. The only thing I would correct is that it's bold to assume that there's any responsibility in that sort of system at all, because that's also a risk that often happens where licenses are brought in and then nobody is in charge of anything, right? Including the CEO. And then you might think that sort of the buck on some level stops there, but it's unclear because it's to say, is this like an operational question? Is this like a tech question? But it's mainly run by the finance department. So should the CFO be in charge? And because you didn't decide anything ahead of time, it's like the responsibility becomes diffused until it no longer really exists, which is another kind of problem. But I think the core of the question is a little bit like, how do you structure this in senior management? And I don't think there is a right answer to that, because I think it depends a lot on what sort of company you are, what sort of previous structures do you have. A lot of companies already have, for example, a chief digital officer, so maybe it makes sense to nestle AI into that. Companies that might not have that since before, maybe they should have a sort of chief AI officer. Maybe it should just go to the CTO, for example, the chief technology officer, if that makes sense, or the operations people, if that's where you're going to frame it. I think there's no real simple answer to that fundamentally, because I think it depends a lot on what's the company and what's the company trying to achieve. But it goes back to this kind of question of having intention in what you're doing. Because the only way to answer that question is to sort of sit down and have a good sense of all right, we're going to adopt because, for this, and this, and therefore it makes sense. Maybe it's a big transformational question. So maybe it should sit with the CEO in that case, right? But if it's purely seen, at least initially, as an operational thing, maybe the COO should be the one that's running the show. But more importantly, and also for the record, if it is something that the company feels that they're really going into uncharted waters, maybe they should create a CAIO role for this, right? But I think more importantly than this is that you're not just talking about putting a label on somebody in senior management and saying, all right, we fixed it, lads, let's take lunch, is more you need that, but you also need structures that go through the whole organization. So you need, yes, somebody in senior management that's kind of where the buck stops, right? Who's has a final responsibility for this kind of initiative, whatever it might be. But you also then need the team leads to have a sense of what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing, to have the correct know-how and the training or whatever. So it's not just but you basically need this stuff to be put in place both at kind of portfolio level, but also at project level, and also in whatever connects portfolio and project. So I think it's a bigger challenge in some ways, and I think it goes back a little bit to it's the same problem as with we bought a load of licenses, now we've adopted AI kind of response. It's sort of the same thing. Oh, we've said that Dave, who's the CTO, he's now in charge of AI, so we're an AI first company now. Which is that only makes sense if he's empowered to both make the necessary structural changes that are required, but also, if it is not, as I said before, it can't just be a top-down initiative. So this is it's a bigger challenge in a lot of ways, basically, as I kind of keep getting back to.
Talking about companies who are notorious for not having any governance whatsoever, you probably saw that the news about Meta completely pulling out what was the AI tool? Muse. That was featured on Instagram. after an immediate public backlash over non consensual data scraping. What I found quite remarkable was it was not the government, especially not the US government, who said anything, it was the public. So, my
Yeah.
question to you is, might it be that the public is the only real guardrail here that is left?
In some cases, that is definitely the way it's turned out. Unfortunately, I think it depends a lot on territory. I think in the U.S. it's kind of largely leaning in that way, and even then, it's largely a matter of also scale. So something needs to be like a big problem in order for that to sort of make companies pull something out, right? Um, I think in other settings, like the EU is trying to be more sort of consumer protection, more rules forward, and so on. We haven't really seen how that's going to turn out in practice yet. It's
Mm,
still sort of a little bit of a sort of work in progress thing, but at least there's an attempt there to sort of try and create some sort of institutional accountability. Um, so it depends a lot. I mean, Singapore is also notorious for having a very close relationship between public and private sector, but also one in which the public sector is not afraid of actually putting its foot down as and when needed, right? So it's not, again, like, like with all of these sort of internet, like big international kind of questions, it depends a lot on exactly where you're looking
mm,
at. But I do fear that there is a lot of the sort of big internationally used models there are based from companies in the US. So there is a definitely like an outsized concern for or like worry about like it's basically the American public needs to reach a critical mass in order to make something like that be pulled back, right? And that is a problem, 100%. And it sort of, I think, ties into a lot of the challenges around like both the regulatory environments that we're seeing. There's a lot of this sort of push and pull around what is the right thing to do and how should we do it. It's like the EU AI Act a good thing to do? Is it not a good thing to do? The EU itself has now, of course, said that or has been kind of reconsidering, reframing, and its enforcement, and so on and so on, which kind of like creates a lot of uncertainty around sort of how we should actually kind of approaching these sort of challenges. Um, but I think I think you're very right. You're very correct that there is very little formal kind of institutional responsibility that's going to be that's currently in place, and that is, I
mm,
think, a massive challenge. And this is not just, I think, on a big scale. Like, we've seen that with the sort of data scraping. I don't know the story exactly in detail. I've not read about it in that sense. I've sort of seen some of the headlines, but what we can see previously with stuff like uh, was it Gemini's image generation, where like it turned out like a black pope and things like that because it was trying to sort of be as diverse as possible, and that ended up backfiring really badly. The problem there is that like very often, if you put sort of potential malice aside and kind of go, yes, some companies are always going to be assholes about certain things, but if you put a pin in that sort of problem for now and think about more like where you have like the best of intentions, but still sort of somebody can still come up with a bad solution to something. And that's like a question of, that's a problem of like kind of testing and assurance, right? Of like, so it's not just a question of big regulatory questions of like, is this a high risk? Is this a low risk model and so on? But it's also things like, are there any watchdog organizations that are in charge of actually assuring whether models live up to certain sort of minimum development standard or best practice or not?
mm,
Which might sound like very boring things, like, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that a lot of the benchmarks at the moment that are used to test like model capacities, they're very often developed by the same sort of computer engineers that are also developing the models. So it's a little bit like they're testing themselves, and they have a certain, they have a certain sort of interest in doing that, of course, but they might not always have the interest to actually push that as far as you should push it, because they're still breaking, do they really want to undermine the potential value of their own creation and the time and effort that was put into it? But also they might lack the know-how. An engineer is not a subject matter expert in like legal doctrine in various
yeah.
countries. So how can they test whether their model is good enough for that or not, right? So it's also, I think, a requirement around, around sort of how is testing carried out, who are developing the actual benchmarks, and so on and so on. So it's a broad challenge that kind of, I think, much like with the internal organization question, it's not just macro. It's not just a macro question. It's like macro and micro, and finding ways to connect those two, right?
So I was actually quite surprised to read that on the other hand, you have Anthropic that pulled out, what is it, Claude Mythos, because it
Mhm.
is capable of autonomously identifying and exploiting software vulnerabilities. And they literally said, well, if we let this loose on the public, it's just way too dangerous. I think there was no response or little response from the American government. So I was actually wondering, if you look at that, do governments or the US government have effectively lost control of the tech landscape, or they are just not bothered with it?
It's a good question, because it's such a I think one thing that, just to sort of say for the record, is that like all of these systems are like kind of black boxed by design, right? So we don't really know exactly how they operate, and it's always worthwhile having a healthy degree of skepticism
Mhm.
when an announcement like this is being made by a company that also seeks to specifically benefit from their model being seen as amazing and brilliant and whatever, right? So there's already a question there, right? That doesn't mean that I'm saying that like Mythos could not in any capacity sort of represent a security risk, but I think a healthy amount of skepticism is needed in order to sort of really be able to engage with these sort of stories in a complete sense. And I think it also touches, on the second part of your question around, you know, very often it would just be governments through various regulatory levers that could actually begin to open up that question meaningfully. And that is, on the one hand, a matter of control, right? Has the US kind of lost control over these corporations? And I think, I mean, put bluntly, probably, I think it's fair to say that they might have done. But I think the bigger question is that, you know, was this done on purpose or not? And I think to some extent, yes. And that's because Silicon Valley has had a model that's worked in the sense that if you kind of have this laissez-faire, freewheeling kind of, blue sky techno-optimistic thinking mixed with like freewheeling capitalism, it's worked. They've created a lot of like sort of bazillion-dollar companies. They've solved a lot of technical challenges. It's led to things that, like, it's led to stuff that has worked. So I think in that sense, it's not perhaps unreasonable for the US government to adopt a position of like, yeah, but why should we, why ruin a good thing? This keeps going, right? Why ruin it? So I think on the one hand, there is a purposeful kind of thing of letting go of control. And this is something that we see. I think there's a lot of conversation around whether this is the only way or what alternative ways can exist and so on. I mean, China is the obvious counterweight to that, which is highly centralized state control. They've been a little bit slower on the development and the uptake, but they've also seemingly have spent the past kind of couple of years developing very stringent guidelines, very stringent internal governance and regulatory requirements and frameworks and best practices and whatever. And now they have seemingly started letting things rip, and they've picked up very, very fast as a result. But I think this is a question of sort of like the US is very often playing to its strength, and they're doing that very well. And their strength lies in this like let her rip, and for a long time in the tech space has been sitting in that sort of frame. China's strength is this sort of centralized, sort of state directed development where, they set certain hard limits, and then within that things are comparably sort of free to do whatever kind of they want to develop, and whatever seems promising, they're investing a lot of state funding into, right? And like, given China's internal structure, that makes sense. I mean, that's them playing to their strength, and it would be crazy to expect them to do something else. So like the matter of control for US companies, I think is like, I think an interesting question, and one that I don't have an answer to, is to what extent could the US government pick up control should it want? Right? If there is the political will, to what extent might you be able to rein these sort of companies or corporations in? I don't know, because I'm not an expert in that particular space. But I think it's an interesting question to consider, kind of as we move forward, and as things like, for example, security risks related to things like Mythos continue to maybe kind of become more common or more prominent, or even larger for that matter. Because maybe then it isn't as, maybe then we will begin to see that, like, it's not so much that they've lost control, it's more like they've given up control until they need to do something about it, or until, for example, public opinion gets to the point where a response kind of becomes forced in some ways, or for any other kind of, economic, political, whatever reason, right? And I think for now, but for now, we're gonna have to rely more on the narratives that come from the corporations themselves. But as I said, they're kind of difficult to parse exactly where there's probably some truth to it. I think it would be insane to say that, they just made this up about Mythos. I think that would be kind of a bit tinfoil hat. But that doesn't mean just because we know that there's some truth to it, doesn't mean we know exactly what where the contours are. And I think that's the big question mark from a kind of governance and regulatory perspective, really.
Dr. Eric Orlowski, thank you so much. But
Thank you for having me.
before I let you go, I would love to hear 3 books that you recommend.
This is always such a difficult question. I mean, based on everything we've talked about here, and I think based on being somebody who works in Southeast Asia with these sort of questions, there's a book called Silicon Valley Imperialism by, I think her name is Erin McElroy, which is all about how Silicon Valley has managed to export its model as like the only or the primary alternative to sort of make tech work. And often at the cost of sort of more local ways of trying to solving local problems with local knowledge kind of approach. So that's one it's a very interesting tracing of like how that's happened and the sort of potential impacts that it's had. And also, I think the importance of like really thinking about alternatives and like alternative ways of developing and doing things. So that's one I would recommend, definitely, more on the sort of critical scholar side. There is one from my, it's a few years old now, but I still think it's worth reading. It's called Rage Inside the Machine by, what's his name? Robert Eric Smith, I think. He's a computer scientist at University College London, also where I got my PhD, but different department. But it's one of the best, I think, it's one of the sort of the best like intro handbooks to like what's actually the problem with all of this, like where are because like he comes very much from the computer science side, so he has an understanding of how it works, but he's written very well in this kind of like more about the sort of social things that come with it, the social challenges that come with it, and he's written about it in a way that's also kind of very approachable. So I would definitely recommend that as like a primer on what all of these problems are and like where the problems sort of technically come from, if that makes sense. It's a good book. I definitely recommend it. And I think third one is it's a slightly older book by a philosopher called Neil Postman, and it's called Technopoly. And it's basically, he traces out the problems of like what happens when technology are no longer a tools but becomes like the actual goal. So like, basically making the case that previously we have developed tools in order to sort of do something with them, right? We developed a hammer so we can put planks together and build a house or whatever. But gradually and he wrote this in like, I think 92. So like, he was kind of way ahead of his time, I think, in some ways, and that makes it a very interesting read. But he kind of makes the case that what happens when we are just developing technology for the sake of developing it, and not really to solve specific challenges or problems anymore. Which is another great book that's really worthwhile reading. It's a very sober take on this kind of like on this sort of like techno-utopian, techno-optimistic hype, where he's basically kind of really bringing it down to like, yeah, but what are we doing any of this for? Then of course I need to do my own shameless plug because I have my own book coming out next month. Uh, Obviously. So this is the fourth bonus recommendation you're getting, and it's called Techno-Utopianism in Everyday Practice in Sweden. I did not set the title, unfortunately. It's a very descriptive title, but it's my own writing and my own research that looks at what are the underlying sort of political and ideological streams that exist in these sort of like, very techno-optimistic, very utopian sort of spaces, and how does that translate into sort of like practices and how we want the future of society and so on to look like. Coming out with Palgrave Macmillan next month, I believe. It's on track.
Dr. Eric Orlowski, thank you so much for your time today. And to our
Thank you for
listeners,
having me.
don't forget to like or subscribe. And we'll see you next time. Thank you again.
Thank you.